The Far Quest, The Chronicles of Cursoon, Book 1, by R. Jason Lynch, copyright 2016 EMP 2023, all rights reserved. Prologue, Passing Time. Though winter was still several weeks away, hints of its soon approach grew more apparent every day. The city park's trees had already begun to turn hues of gold, scarlet, and deep crimson, giving the entire grounds a glow of warmth. Whenever the cool autumn breeze blew through the treetops, their leaves showered down like fiery-colored snowflakes. Upon the ground, they rustled along, being driven by the mild gusts, and thus they seemed to dance across both path and field in a kind of ballet in which all nature played some part. Towering over the trees, the city's skyscrapers and high-rise apartment buildings enclosed the park like a wall around a secret garden. The busy noises of the city outside were like a distant and restless dream long forgotten by those who visited. This was a sanctuary where the sweet songs of birds and the joyful cadence of playing children drowned out even the loudest and harshest sounds of the metropolis. Within the park's nearly 3 square miles, the vastness of the surrounding city's traffic lights and hardened concrete were softly replaced by lush grassy glades and quiet, peaceful groves. It was in this same park, by a shaded path, that a young woman sat alone upon a bench, with her face hidden in her hands. Her eyes were filled with heavy tears that splashed down into the tender blades of grass at her feet. Thus, the loveliness of her surroundings went unseen by the blurred panes of her vision. As she quietly wept, an old man approached, but in her grief, she hardly noticed him as he sat down upon the opposite end of the bench. He had been drawn there by the small patch of sunshine that filtered down through the trees and splashed the seat with light. The spot was comfortably warm, and it caused him to cheerfully hum to himself. Though the young woman could not place it, the tune was strangely familiar. It was as if she had heard the song in a dream, long forgotten. His humming was what made her notice him for the first time. Hearing the tune, she only glanced at his shoes, and so she observed how they were 2 different shades of brown and quite scuffed. However, she was far too filled with despair to consider him for more than a moment. Quickly returning to her own thoughts, she pulled her coat tightly around herself in a vain attempt to shut out the ever-intruding world.
Sorrow is a burden more easily borne among friends.
The old man spoke for the first time.
If you want, I should like to be such a friend to you.
She didn't answer, nor did she look up. She simply wondered if he was speaking to her.
What bitter grief makes you weep so?
He added with a tone of compassion. This time it was impossible for her to pretend that she did not know to whom he spoke. She looked at his shoes once more and answered in a voice that was scarcely more than a whisper.
Earlier this week I found out I'm pregnant.
She was surprised that she had declared her terrible secret aloud, and moreover she found that it felt good to admit it to another person. The old man looked puzzled.
But shouldn't that news bring joy?
I didn't mean to. I'm not ready to be a mom. I'm too young. And I still have so much of my own life to live.
She answered haltingly, while wiping away a tear that tickled her cheek as it ran down her face. With these words, the young woman sat up and looked at the man for the first time. Though his gruff voice fit with his appearance, she felt his eloquent manner of speech did not suit him, for she was sure he was nothing more than a homeless person. He wore an old, ragged navy blue coat, and on his hands he wore dark brown gloves with the fingertips worn away. Beneath his coat, his t-shirt was a faded blue, and his khaki cargo pants were nearly threadbare in one knee. Having seen all his clothing, she quickly moved her eyes to inspect the top of his head, partly because she wanted to avoid looking at him face to face, and partly because her gaze was drawn there by something brightly colored. Thus, she found that the top of his head was crowned with an old fishing hat that was tie-dyed in a rainbow pattern. Though it was now faded by time, it still bore hints of its once brilliant hues. Finally, and reluctantly, she turned her attention to his face, which she found as old as she had pictured it. It was covered in a long gray beard that had gone many years without being trimmed. Long hair hung down from under his colorful hat and flowed over his shoulders in stringy gray locks. His bushy gray eyebrows overhung each of his eyes like two straw-thatched roofs. Seeing all these features, she quickly concluded that, like his voice, his face fit well with his frayed and worn clothing. However, when she looked into his eyes, she was amazed that they seemed so very out of place. They were like deep, cool blue pools of water and seemed wet with a youthful glow, though they lay amid the parched and cracked landscape of his aged face. Unlike his hat, his eyes were not faded by time, nor dimmed by the shadows of much tribulation, even though she was sure he had seen his share. Wordlessly, she longed to have such eyes as his. Undimmed by tears, they seemed full of some kind of magical hope, wholly unknown to her.
I see,
he replied thoughtfully, as he fixed his gaze upon her.
and so now you search for a remedy to alleviate your difficulty.
The young woman shook her head slowly and turned away to look down the path.
No, I already know what I have to do.
You do?
The man responded softly, while he watched her with sympathy filling his vibrant blue eyes.
Yeah, I've already made an appointment.
Looking at her watch, she tapped its glass face.
It's in a little more than 3 hours. I know, I'm really early, but I didn't want to just sit around alone in my apartment waiting. So I came here. The clinic is just around the corner, so... yeah.
The old man looked at her with uncertainty. Though it was clear he had yet another question, he seemed unable or even unwilling to ask it. She guessed his question easily enough.
I'm going to the clinic to have the pregnancy terminated.
Taking in a sharp breath, she began to cry again.
But honestly, I'm scared.
She admitted with a quivering voice.
There's always that chance that something could go.
Her fear would not let her finish this sentence. Wordlessly, the old man took off his gloves and stuffed them into his pocket. While he did this, his blue eyes were fixed upon a handful of small children as they played in a sandbox some distance away.
So that's it?
The young woman asked, looking slightly annoyed.
All those questions and now you don't have anything else to say?
She shook her head and looked at her watch again.
Figures.
Not seeming to notice her annoyance, he pointed across the path.
Do you see those children away there playing in the sand?
The old man asked as he gestured in their direction with a wrinkled hand. The knuckles of every one of his fingers were so knobby that they reminded her of the gnarled branches of an ancient tree. After glancing at the kids, she gave her answer with a sigh.
Yeah, I see them. Why?
She did not really want to look at children right then. Instead, she studied the old man.
Didn't he hear my confession?
She wondered silently.
Why is he changing the subject?
As I watch them, I'm reminded of Riven.
The old man spoke with a kind of dreamy tone, as though he was remembering someone or something from long ago.
Who is Riven?
She asked, echoing the name.
Riven isn't a who.
He chuckled as though she should have known this.
Riven is a where.
Okay.
She replied, looking up at him and rolling her eyes.
Where is it then?
The old man grinned and tapped his temple.
Riven is in here.
In your head?
She asked, with a note of skepticism.
In my daydreams.
The old man answered with a nod.
My daydreams are filled with a whole world and its name is Riven.
He looked at her with a raised eyebrow.
Do you understand?
She shrugged.
Yeah, I think so. Kind of like a place where you can take a mental vacation, right?
His grin returned.
Yes, I suppose you could put it that way.
I smell a story.
She thought to herself as she weakly returned his smile for the first time.
This could be a good way to kill 3 hours and keep my mind off.
She quickly turned her thoughts back to the old man.
So, what's Riven like?
She asked, while absently glancing at the sandbox and then quickly returning her gaze to the old man's profile.
Is it a world covered in sand?
At first, the aged man made no reply. Instead, he fixed his eyes upon the children as their tiny hands scooped the sand together into what looked like the dunes of a desert. He hummed to himself once more as though he was remembering something again. When he finished a portion of the tune, he answered her question.
Actually, Riven was covered with dust. Of course, there was some sand mixed in, but mostly it was covered in a reddish-brown dust. However, I was thinking of a time before the great desert had swallowed the whole world. In those days, it only stretched across Riven, from north to south like an immense scar several hundred miles long.
While she watched the old man gazing at the sandbox as though he saw something she could not, he no longer looked homeless, but instead it seemed as though he was a way-worn traveler, far from home. It was as if he was a stranger from a strange land, and suddenly he seemed to be brimming with magical secrets. She almost imagined that rusty-colored dust sprinkled from him as he moved. The old storyteller continued.
To those travelers who beheld the great desert for the first time, it looked like a vast scalding sea of reddish-brown waves sculpted in dust, and thus it gained its second name, the Sea of Fire. Nevertheless, those who lived near to its borders called it by its first name, the Weeping Waste. They most often used this name because of the sad song that was ever carried upon its wind, for it sounded like a woman crying and singing some wordless lament. The great desert was an arid land of burning heat during the day, and a frigid and cold expanse after the sun sank into the west, for the day's heat quickly ebbed from the dust-covered landscape. It was upon the borders of this very same desert that a young shepherdess lay dreaming. Her name was Livid, and she was completely devoid of colour.
Devoid of color?
The young woman repeated with unsuppressed surprise.
What do you mean?
The old man answered in a tone that hinted at his own astonishment.
Her whole person was grey. Where most people have colour in their eyes, hers were a pale shade of grey without any hints of colour. Her skin was like white ash, and a darker grey hue encircled her eyes and flushed her sunken cheeks. Her dry, cracked lips were pale grey, and even the inward parts of her mouth, nose and eyelids were a darker shade of grey. When she took off the tattered rust-coloured scarf that she wrapped around her hair dangled down in lifeless locks of mingled grey. In fact, if she bled, even her blood came forth in droplets of dark grey liquid. To tell you the truth, her total lack of colour made her look terribly sick.
But why didn't she have any color?
The young woman blurted out. The old storyteller answered with a shrug.
She didn't know, but then, that's where stories always begin, isn't it? Would you like me to tell you about her adventure?
The young woman nodded with eager interest.